Thank you guys for getting up early this morning and making it to our first presentation, because this woman is definitely worth getting up early for. Our first speaker today is Amaroq Weiss from the Center for Biological Diversity. Amaroq is the senior West Coast wolf advocate for the center. A biologist and former attorney, Amaroq has worked in wolf conservation for more than 21 years. In her work for the Center for Biological Diversity, she focuses on wolf recovery and protections in Washington, Oregon, and California, and at the federal level. Previously, she has worked for the Mexican Wolf Conservation Fund, California Wolf Center, and Defenders of Wildlife on wolf conservation policy, litigation strategy, and on-the-ground efforts on the West Coast, Northern Rocky Mountains, Alaska, and the Southwest. She is a very busy lady. Amaroq was a stakeholder advisor to Oregon and California state wildlife agencies as they developed their state wolf conservation and management plans. She is an annually invited speaker at the Public Interest Environmental Law Conference and is frequently interviewed by print journalists and for public radio. A former competitive skater in women's flat track roller derby, Amaroq now lives a calm and serene, yeah, right. No, she doesn't. No, those of us who know her know this is not true. A calm and serene life in Petaluma, California with her husband Terry and their two beautiful and bossy Siberian Huskies, Miranda and Tyga. And you know, a lot of you in here do know Amaroq and her work, and those of you who don't, she works tirelessly. I've never seen anyone work so hard, and she's an absolute inspiration to advocates everywhere. So it's an honor to welcome Amaroq Weiss.
So as an old lady in the wolf world, I get to say something like this, which is, this is an amazing conference. I have been to so many conferences in these past 21 years, and I've never seen anything put together so well as this, so well advertised, so well coordinated, such great speakers, such an assembly of things for your silent auction and for the local vendors. It is a community event, but it is also a nationwide event. And I salute you. I salute Plan B, I salute Apex Protection, and I salute all of you who are here to support them in this amazing effort, because this is something special. So 6 years ago, when I was giving talks about wolves in the West Coast states, I frequently titled my presentation, West Coast Wolves, Can Things Be Different Here? And so 6 years later, what I can tell you now is definitively, yes and no. Because what we've seen is that the strong support for wolves that exists in the West Coast states by the residents who live there is not being reflected by the wolf plans, by the policies, by the on-the-ground actions by the state agencies in those states. And so for wolf advocates, what this means is that constant vigilance is necessary. Constant pushback is necessary. Over the last 20 years, there have been multiple surveys done in these 3 West Coast states, and they all show that there is emphatic support for wolves, for wolf protections, for wolf recovery, for an emphasis on non-lethal measures so people can coexist with wolves and livestock. And something else more interesting than these surveys is it tends to show that this idea that there is an urban-rural divide on wolves actually might be a myth. And I'm going to take you through the highlights of these 6 surveys in a moment, but first let me just kind of introduce you to a few of the wolves from the states and orient you to what the situation is with pack numbers and where they're located in each of those states. So these are some photos of some wolves from Washington, Oregon, and California. That lower left photo is one. If you were here yesterday and you heard Carter Niemeyer's talk, he said, if there is a wolf about whom I'm going to write a book, it will be this wolf. Well, that was a different photo, but it's that wolf in the lower far corner. Yes? No? He's going to keep it a secret. That's a wolf from the Smack Out Pack in Washington, and there's a tale that goes with that wolf, but I'm going to let Carter tell it when he writes his book. In the upper left corner is the female breeder of the Lassen Pack in California and 2 of her pups. That photo was taken in 2017. The first year it was confirmed that that pack existed and had pups. And then over in the right corner is some adults from the Middle Fork pack in Oregon. Now, in Washington and Oregon, each of those state agencies issue an annual report. And California is not doing annual reports yet. They're starting to do quarterly reports. But in Washington and Oregon, they issue an annual report every spring, which reports on the wolf population numbers that were determined by the end of December of the previous year. So the 2018 report is not out yet. It should be coming out any day for Oregon and Washington. So the figures I'm going to show you here are from last year's report. As of the end of 2017, this is a map of Oregon, and all of the dark blue splotches are known pack territories, and then the splotches that are crosshatched in blue are estimated areas of wolf use, where there have been wolf sightings, but it hasn't been confirmed that there's an actual pack there. So as of the end of 2017, there were a known 124 wolves in Oregon in 12 packs, with 11 successful breeding pairs in those packs. In Washington, same situation. These are the figures from last year. So in this map of Washington, you can see the state is divided up into 3 different recovery zones. Most of Washington's wolves are in the northeastern portion of the state. Some are now in the central portion. And in Washington, as of the end of last year, there were reported 122 wolves in 20 packs with 14 breeding pairs. This map from California is the most recent map. This was published by CDFW, the agency there, in January of this year, showing the pack territory of the one known confirmed wolf pack currently in California, the Lassen pack. Now, there was a prior pack in California, the Shasta pack, which was confirmed in Siskiyou County in 2015. Shortly after some livestock predations happened, that pack mysteriously disappeared. And we all have some theories about what may have happened to them. One of them actually did turn up in Nevada about 6 months later. That wolf hasn't been seen since either. But there are additionally, besides the Lassen pack, a couple of known radio-collared Oregon wolves wandering around in California. So currently there are probably about 10 to 12 confirmed wolves in California. There might be a few more that aren't collared that we just don't know about. So now let's take a look at these surveys. And you're going to see that these show incredibly strong support for wolves in the West Coast states. So this poll was taken in 1999, and it was taken way back then because that was right after the first wolf from Idaho had crossed into the state. This was wolf B45, and she came into the state in January, February of 1999. The state didn't realize that wolves were listed on their own state ESA and had to be left alone, so they demanded that the feds capture her and take her back to Idaho, which they did. In 24 hours, she promptly traveled 70 miles back towards Oregon, but then ended up staying in Idaho and lived there for quite some time. So later that spring, a poll was conducted to see what are Oregonians' attitudes about having wolves come back to Oregon. And it turns out that 70% favor the return of wolves to Oregon. And this urban-rural divide, at this point we begin to get an inkling that maybe Eastern Oregon isn't as anti-wolf as we thought, because you can see from those figures, if I can see from those figures, I think it's 74% of metropolitan Portland folks thought wolf recovery was fine, but it's at 58% in Eastern Oregon, where you'd think that the opposition would be so much greater. So then in 2011, there was a survey that was done in Washington. And this was a survey, it wasn't just about wolves, it was to get an idea of how people felt about places, wild places in Washington and wildlife. It was part of a state report. And that showed that 74.5% of Washington residents supported wolves recolonizing the state on their own. I am going to step down here because I can't see that. I need to be a flounder with eyes on the side of my head, right? So, yeah, maybe not such an attractive look. In 2013, there was a survey that was done across all 3 states, and I've highlighted them across all 3 states there, and you can see that support for restoring wolves to the state was very high in all 3, 69% in California, 66% in Oregon, 71% in Washington. Very high support for people who think that wolves should be protected in their own state and think that wolves are a part of America's natural heritage. 83% support in California, 68% in Oregon, 75% in Washington. And then enormous support for the belief that wolves play an important role in the ecosystem. So finally, this message is getting out to people that wolves play a key role and that we need them and that they are essential, and that people understood that restoring wolves could actually help restore ecosystem balance in their own state. 73% in California, 69% Oregon, 74% in Washington. Not sure where I'm aiming this. Okay, so there was another survey that was done in 2014, and this was a survey that was trying to tally what are people's general thoughts about predators in general in Washington. So bears, cougars, wolves. 70% support maintaining sustainable populations of predators. 64% supported wolf recovery. 61% support the state getting involved to provide cost share so that non-lethal measures could be used by livestock producers to live with wolves. And 65% of those thought that non-lethal should be the primary means to address conflict. 2015 was the year that the State Commission decided to prematurely delist wolves from their own State Endangered Species Act, and we ended up suing over that. That lawsuit is still pending. But so we thought it was really important to see what does the rest of the state think about protections for wolves under the state ESA. So Mason-Dixon polling did this poll for the Pacific Wolf Coalition. Turns out that 66% of Oregonians wanted ESA, Endangered Species Act protections under the state law to remain in place for those wolves. And again, we see this urban-rural divide is maybe a little bit of a myth because 72% of metropolitan Portland folks agreed with this, but 60% of Eastern Oregonians, the most rural part of the states, also agreed that wolves should stay protected under the state ESA. So this is a busy slide. I'm going to kind of interpret it for you. 2016 was the year that the state in Oregon began to update its state wolf plan. And one of the topics that kept coming up is, are we going to have hunting of wolves in Oregon? And this is a topic we're going to see coming up more and more in both Oregon and Washington as wolves get to the recovery goals that have been set by those states. So in the Pacific Wolf Coalition, we actually wanted to know what did people think about killing wolves for any number of reasons, whether it's for livestock protection, whether it's for to protect deer and elk, because we knew that this was all coming to a head because one of the reasons that hunters say we need to hunt wolves is to protect elk. And one of the reasons livestock producers say we need to hunt wolves is to protect livestock. So there's a lot of nuances to figuring out how do people feel about killing wolves for this reason or that reason or the other. So we tried to pick this apart. So overall, 72.2% of people do support the agency killing wolves when there are repeated livestock losses, but 69.8% of them thought that Oregon should emphasize non-lethal measures, and 72.8% believed that the agency should require the use of non-lethal measures for solving conflicts before they ever resort to killing wolves. And you can see, well, actually, I'll go through the whole thing and then I'll talk about the urban-rural. So when polled whether or not people actually think that wolves are an economic threat to the livestock industry that would necessitate killing wolves, 67.3% do not believe that that's the case. 81.9% think that poaching poses a much greater threat to elk and deer than wolves do. 67.3% oppose hunting wolves as a means to keep elk and deer herds healthy. And 72.4% oppose any trophy hunting of wolves. What I want to say about the urban-rural divide, since these numbers are kind of small here on the screen, is that there's a breakdown for each one of these questions, and on no one of them is the difference any more than by 10 percentage points. In some cases, the difference is only like 3 percentage points. In one instance, the support is even stronger in the rural communities. So for instance, of those who think that poaching poses a greater threat to elk and deer than wolves do, whereas urbanites believe that's the case, 83.1% of them, 87.9% of rural people realize that poaching poses a much greater threat to elk and deer than wolves ever do. And I think that's in part because they live there. They see the elk and deer. They are also the people who come across the elk and deer that have been illegally poached and turn it into law enforcement. So they actually have a pretty good read on that. This is fascinating to me because the media loves to play up this big rural-urban divide. And it's true that in rural areas, people don't like to speak out. But when you're asked on the phone a survey question, then you can say in confidence how you really feel about an issue. So what we're seeing by these polls is that there are these strong values of support for wolves in the West Coast states, but the actions and the policies and the state plans instead reflect a really strong dose of old, entrenched views about how to manage predators, including a desire to limit wolf populations and to kill wolves to address conflicts. And I'll give you some examples. So in each of these 3 states, they have set very, very low recovery goals. I'm going to come back down here again. Oh, well, it's okay. It's good for me, exercise. In Oregon, their recovery goals are 14 successful breeding pairs for 3 consecutive years. They divided the state in half, and they want to get 7 successful breeding pairs for 3 consecutive years in each side of the state. So that's a really low number. Washington, they've divided the state into 3 regions, and they want to get a total of 15 successful breeding pairs for 3 consecutive years. They could also get to recovery by having 18 breeding pairs for just 1 year. Again, that's very, very low numbers. And then California, their state plan says that when we get to 8 successful breeding pairs for 2 consecutive years, they may consider delisting at that point. These states also look at ways that they can reduce wolf protections as quickly as possible. So in Oregon, their state wolf plan is a phased adaptive management plan. And what that means is that over time, there are decreased requirements for transparency, decreased requirements for accountability by both the agency and the ranchers. And then over time, there are lower and lower thresholds for which they can then go to kill wolves. In California, the state agency opposed listing the wolf under the State Endangered Species Act. It took the entire public testifying before the commission and presenting the science and the law, and thank goodness the commission overrode their own agency and did decide to list wolves, but the state agency didn't want state listing because California's State Endangered Species Act is so protective. At this low a number of wolves, it would prohibit any take of wolves, any killing of wolves for livestock conflicts. And California, if we get to 2 breeding pairs in 2 years, they may petition the feds to downlist wolves from federally endangered to federally threatened in California. Washington has developed these protocols for addressing wolf-livestock interactions, and the protocols don't even have requirements. They just say they're expectations, and they're really minimal expectations for the use of non-lethal before the agency will go to killing wolves. And the protocol essentially promotes killing wolves very quickly once conflicts arise. We see the states ignoring their own wolf plan. So Oregon's wolf plan was adopted in 2005, updated in 2010, and then in 2011 they began to ignore their own wolf plan and they began killing wolves very quickly without documenting the non-lethals that had been used, which is required by the plan. And the only way we stop them is through litigation. The Center for Biological Diversity, Oregon Wild, and Cascadia Wildlands sued them, and through a settlement we were able to get much higher levels of transparency and accountability and thresholds, at least in phase 1 of the wolf plan. In Washington, they've been killing wolves under circumstances that violate some really key science that's in their own wolf plan and goals that are in their own wolf plan. So for instance, there's science in there that talks about that if you're going to kill wolves for livestock conflicts and they have pups, you shouldn't kill those wolves until the pups are at least 6 months old. And if you're going to kill wolves where there's pups in the pack, you shouldn't kill wolves unless there's at least 6 wolves in the pack, at least 3 of which are adults. They've been violating that every single time, both of those when they've been killing wolves. The plan talks about killing problem wolves, but the agency doesn't kill problem wolves, and they admit that. They admit that they kill whichever wolf they're ever put a bullet in. The agency also has been ignoring their own goals and objectives in the plan that talk about minimizing disturbance near den and rendezvous sites and minimizing mortality during den and rendezvous sites. But they allow lots of disturbance at den and rendezvous sites. They allow livestock to be all over those sites and don't require the livestock producers to move them. And then they kill wolves right near dens and rendezvous sites after there have been livestock conflicts. So we have a lawsuit pending regarding the agency violating its own state wolf plan and several state laws. Premature state delisting. This was actually done in Oregon. So in 2015, the state delisted wolves when there were only 85 wolves in the state, despite overwhelming, I'm talking tens of thousands of public comments and hundreds of people who showed up to testify, and letters from over 24 scientists, not just nationally, but internationally, pointing out what was wrong with their science and that wolves still face threats. And the state agency there would like to see wolves federally delisted in the state. Currently, they're delisted in the eastern 1/3, but they want them delisted in the western 2/3 as well. Washington also would like to have that same thing happen, because in Washington, wolves are federally delisted in the eastern 1/3 of the state, but they are still federally protected in the western 2/3 of the state. And Washington would like to see that federal protection go away. And every year in Washington, there are legislative attempts to delist regionally within the state, and the agency will work with those legislators to craft those bills behind the scenes. In California, the draft wolf plan, when it went out for public comment, it initially proposed that the state might seek delisting of wolves from the State Endangered Species Act when there were only 50 to 75 wolves in the state. And it took huge public pushback in all of our comments and testimony to move that needle up, so that the final wolf plan, when it came out, now talks about potentially delisting wolves when there's 153 to 190 wolves, which is still way too low. We see legislative shenanigans by Republicans, by Democrats who get snookered by Republicans. And then at the end of the legislative session, when there's all this horse trading going on, I'll sign this bill, I'll vote for that one if you vote for this one. So we've been seeing in Washington repeated attempts to regionally delist in just one or two of those regions instead of waiting till wolves are recovered statewide. We've seen attempts to designate wolves as game mammals in Washington under the pretense that that's how they will raise the poaching fines for wolves. There's other ways you can raise poaching fines without designating what you can change the poaching law. Attempts to get bills that would require translocating wolves out of northeastern Washington and putting them on the Olympic Peninsula or putting them on Bainbridge Island or wherever else the legislator decide that it would be funny to say, let's move the wolves there. We've seen legislators who have been ratifying illegal commission decisions with bills. And what I'm talking about is back in 2015 when Oregon delisted wolves, which we believe was illegal and which we have a lawsuit pending over. Shortly after that, the legislature introduced a bill sponsored by 2 Republicans that would just ratify that decision, just say, yeah, wolves met all the criteria. Yeah, good job, commission. That was the right thing to do. It's lawful what you did. And the problem with that is that's the legislature making a decision that only a court can decide. And so the legislature actually did pass this bill, and the governor actually did sign it into law. But 2 other things came up, and then it turned out the legislators were lying to the other legislators in their testimony. They said, oh, no, it won't moot out the lawsuit. Oh, no, that's not our intention. We're just patting the agency on the back. And in testimony later, it turned out they revealed their true intention was to try to stop our lawsuit. So some of us filed a ethics complaint with the State Ethics Legislative Committee. Get ready. Turns out it's perfectly legal for legislators to lie to each other in Oregon. They can't lie to the public, but when they testify to each other about their bills and why they're introducing it, what effect it will have, it's okay for them to lie to the other legislators. And then one of the attorneys who filed that ethics complaint, the legislator had introduced the bill, then filed a bar ethics complaint against him for filing the ethics complaint. It was just crazy. So in that same situation, the governor actually was not going to sign that bill. We had all put enough pressure on her to realize she should not sign it. And then she discovered that her own natural resources staffer had been cutting backroom deals with the Republicans, saying, the governor will sign this bill in exchange for your vote on her transportation bill. And she found herself definitely caught between a rock and a hard place, and she signed the bill. But it's being challenged in our lawsuit. So then we also saw in Oregon a situation where we did convince the commission and the legislators that what they needed to do was raise the poaching fines on wolves, which were only at $1,000, and we got it raised to $6,500, which sounds like a big increase, but when you consider that fines for poaching like bighorn sheep is about $25,000 or $50,000 in Oregon, then a $6,500 fine isn't that much. But even worse yet, just as that poaching law was about to be passed, somebody introduced an amendment that said, well, this doesn't apply if the poaching took place while you were engaged in some otherwise lawful activity. And if you think about it, in Oregon, it's legal to shoot coyotes. And how often is it that people shoot coyotes, or they're out shooting coyotes and they shoot a wolf and they say, well, I thought it was a coyote. So really what they just did, if you know what the McKittrick policy is, and if you don't, I won't go into a whole lot of detail, but they basically inserted a federal policy in here that said, if you're out there shooting coyotes and you kill a wolf and you claim you thought you were shooting coyotes, then you're excused and that poaching fine actually doesn't apply to you. So the other thing that we see is just kind of a devaluing of wolves. The wolf plans, their favorite words, if you read these wolf plans carefully, what you'll see are these words over and over again. Challenging, problems, concerns, obstacles. Wolf plans never or rarely use words like exciting or opportunity or conservation opportunity or essential or valued, unless you're reading the chapter on elk and deer in the wolf plan. And then you'll see words like that talking about the elk and deer. You also repeatedly will hear in hearings that agency staff commissions talk about how they want to normalize wolves. And what they are saying is they want the public to view them as bears or cougars, huntable game mammals. I don't think that's normal. The wolf plans themselves, they continue to use this idea of social tolerance as a rationale for why wolves have to be killed and why they put that in their wolf plan. And yet the fact is, there is no science that shows that killing wolves increases social tolerance for living with wolves. And on the other hand, there are multiple papers now published, not just in America, but in also other parts of the world that have wolves that show killing wolves actually is linked to reduced social tolerance for wolves. The result has been enormous public outrage. These are protests outside the governor's mansion when she signed that bill into law. These are protests in California when the state agency was arguing against listing wolves, and we were outside commission hearings about to go in and testify and explain to them why they needed to override their agency's recommendation. In Washington, several times we've held rallies outside the WDFW headquarters when they've been engaged in some major wolf slaughters in 2016 and most recently again in 2018. And so what we're really seeing here is that we are combating state agency cognitive dissonance over left coast values. And it really isn't denial. It really is that the agency is very selective about what reality they want to accept. So how do we combat this? With weapons of mass cognitive dissonance destruction. And so what are those? Public Records Act requests. We've been able to find enormous amounts of information about these decisions that are being made, whether they're based on anything rational or not, or some kind of influence through Public Records Act requests. If you just saw in the news this week, we were able to reveal that the new nominee, I guess his vote is today, David Bernhardt for Secretary of the Department of Interior, he completely squelched reports that 3 different pesticides were contributing to the extinction of over 1,300 endangered species. And the reason we were able to find that out is through Public Records Act requests. So any of you want information about what your agency is doing, you make those Public Records Act requests, or you find a group to work with you to do so, because what you find in those emails and reports will sometimes shock you and make you shout with glee at what you just found. Public testimony is really critical. I think you heard from Jill Fritz's talk yesterday how important it was for the public voice to be out there so that the commissioners and the legislators aren't just in this echo chamber and hearing from the antis. They need to hear from you. They need to hear from you every time, over and over. Investigative journalism. If you can find some great reporters in your states who want to see your Public Records Act request results, who want to dive into these issues, they will do mass pieces on the newspapers, which will alert all kinds of citizens who had no idea these tricky things were going on behind the scenes. Op-eds and letters to the editor. So I can write an op-ed and I can get my voice out there in the Seattle Times, the Oregonian, the SAC-B, but just as important, and maybe even more important, are these letters to the editor. You might not know this, but the letters to the editor section is the most widely read section of any newspaper anywhere in the country. That is what people who pick up a newspaper read. They want to know what people in their community think about particular issues. So you see a wolf article, if it's a great article, write the paper, thank them, and say what they wrote that was great about it. If you see an article that has misinformation about it, write them, thank them for posting the article, but say, however, you left out A, B, and C. So then your letter becomes the way to educate the public. Commission compositions. Jill also talked about this yesterday, about how these commissioners are making decisions about our wildlife. They're appointed by the governor. They're not elected by the public. And so as members of the public, it's our job to find out who those commissioners are, what districts they represent, when are they termed out, when will those seats become open, and to try to identify candidates who would be much better on those commissions, who have backgrounds in science and ecology, and will be doing things that aren't just beholden to special interest groups, and get that person introduced to the governor. Sometimes they have to be introduced by a donor to the governor, because then the governor sits up and pays attention. But we have to find out when those commission seats are becoming available and see what we can do to get them filled with people that will make wise decisions about the public's wildlife. Agency budgets are really critical to pay attention to. When the legislature is putting the budget for the next 2 years or so together, there's always going to be a component that relates to wildlife management. There have been instances where we have been able to work together with other groups. Last year, Oregon Governor Kate Brown was going to completely line out of her budget $900,000. It was going to go to the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Oregon Department of Agriculture for non-lethal management of wildlife. And we almost had it out, and then something happened at the last minute and it went back in. But so we're working with her on the budget again this year. So there are very specific things aimed at wolf management in budgets. But if you pay attention to what's going on when the legislature is putting these budgets together, you can also testify and write letters and contact your legislators about that, about what you think the money should be used for, that it should be used for non-lethal measures. Lobbying the legislators and governors, going and actually meeting with them. They need to hear from you. I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next part of my talk. And then ballot initiatives, because we do live in West Coast states that are very progressive in their attitudes and laws to protect animals, not just wildlife, but we have some of the strongest domestic animal protection laws in the West Coast as well in some of the states. That if we get to the point where we are looking at potentially wolf hunting in Oregon or Washington, which I think is going to be on the horizon, we will be able to go to ballot initiatives. And just as Jill showed those very successful efforts in Michigan, we will be able to do the same thing here to override those attempts. So, oops, where did we go? Are you sure that you have my revised version? Because there's one more slide here. You're not sure. Okay. Well, this should be interesting. Okay. I may hand you a flash drive. That won't work. Do you know, Betsy? Because there should be.
This is the only one I have.
We'll just take a technical pause for a moment. Because this never happens, right? It's not a critical next slide, but it is what let me know that they don't have my revised version. So,
We have to wing it.
really?
Yeah, otherwise we'd have to start the PowerPoint all over again.
We can't start it over and just quickly tap through. I can tap through each one. But I'm changing. She didn't send it to you. Oh.
But it's not loaded in.
Okay, all right, well, that's fine. That's fine. So what we thought we'd do is, because I'm going to be transitioning into a totally another topic, which is our Call of the Wild campaign, before I do that, let's do some question and answer now about the things that I just talked about. We'll do question and answer for maybe 10 minutes, and then I'll move into the second part of my talk. Yeah.
Thank you. Could you speak a little bit more about the, what was the term, social tolerance in the wolf plans? What exactly does that mean?
That's a great question. What does social tolerance mean? So when wolf plans mention the term social tolerance, what they're talking about is what is the tolerance by the public for living with wolves, what measures do we need to take that will make the public more tolerant of living with wolves and more accepting over time of living with wolves? And one of the mantras that agency staff have been saying for decades is that in order to save wolves, we need to kill some of them, because being able to kill some of them will relieve some of the concerns that people have about living with wolves. That might mean the agency gets to kill some wolves for livestock conflicts, and that's going to make other people feel better because they know that the problem will be taken care of. It might mean that the agency or the state decides to, if wolves are delisted, open hunting and trapping seasons so the public itself can be involved in killing wolves. And that way it will let the public let off some steam so they'll feel like they can kind of take out their frustrations, and they know that they've killed some animals, and so now they're going to be able to live with them better. It turns out what the studies are showing is that people's attitudes towards living with wolves actually decreases in tolerance if agencies start killing wolves and or if agencies allow state-sanctioned hunting and trapping seasons of wolves. And it is believed that the reason that may be is that allowing the killing of wolves gives a signal to the public that wolves are maybe not so valuable after all. And so we can start killing them. And so what you actually see from these surveys are reduced social tolerance. I'm less wanting to live with wolves now. And you see a greater inclination to poach. People actually admitting their desire to poach has actually gone up now that wolves can be killed. And then what they're finding is there are actual greater incidences of poaching. So it's not a direct link, but it is very, very closely associated. And this is what the science is actually saying. So for years, agency folks have been speaking from their gut. If we let people kill a few wolves, there will be increased social tolerance. Nobody ever studied it scientifically. When scientists actually studied it, did surveys over time, and a lot of these surveys were done in the Midwest when protections were lifted and then returned and then lifted and then returned because of court rulings, they could actually measure what people's responses were when wolves were protected versus when wolves were allowed to be killed. They've done some similar studies in Europe where allowing hunting of wolves they thought would increase people's social tolerance, and it turns out it's just the opposite. So
it's just code for, within these plans, for the rationale for folks to do whatever they want to do.
It is. And there's one author, Adrian Trevis, who one of his papers on this very subject I think is very aptly titled. It's called Blood Does Not Buy Goodwill. And you know, that's human nature. You give people who want blood, and more blood they will want.
Because if you explained it carefully, nobody would buy it.
If you explain it carefully, nobody would buy it. But you also, I think, when you're testifying to commissions and legislators, need to not just explain it, but say, look, there's not a stitch of published science that shows that is true. And on the other hand, there is published science that shows the opposite is true. Yep, exactly. Okay.
Say what you're just saying is the phenomenon in Idaho is absolutely fits that. They've let them kill a few more, kill a few more. Now you've got anti-wolf groups who are pushing the legislature, but more so the commission, and it's on a roll now. I mean, they're adding more wolves to individuals that they can kill, more ways to kill them, longer trap checks, longer seasons, open year-round on private land. It is exactly what you describe. The more you let them kill them, the more they want to kill.
I hate when I'm right.
Someone over here?
Yeah, there was back
Raise
there,
their hand right here that she had called on.
back there in the black T-shirt.
Black T-shirt. Oh, black
Sue, I
T-shirt.
think.
Okay.
I don't know if you're going to address this later in your talk here, but could you talk a little bit about the lawsuit you mentioned? You mentioned that there was a lawsuit going on in Oregon now,
Yeah. So
and I'd like to know a little bit more about that. And Is CBD collaborating with other, what kind of a collaboration is there in bringing this lawsuit? Is there several groups involved, or what's going on with that?
Yep. So very frequently when we're bringing lawsuits in Oregon on wolf-related issues, our partners in those lawsuits will be Oregon Wild and Cascadia Wildlands. Those are two groups that we work with very, very closely in Oregon on wolf issues. We also work with Defenders of Wildlife on wolf issues in Oregon. They have not been on any lawsuits with us so far, but we work with them on a lot of legislative stuff and pressure on the governor and the commission hearings. So this particular lawsuit was brought in 2011. How many people here are familiar with wolf OR7, the wolf that came from Oregon to California? Okay, so his father, OR4, the breeding male of the Amnaha pack, was under a kill order at that time. There had been several livestock conflicts, and the agency was prepared to shoot him and other members of the pack. And we did some research, and actually it was Nick Cady from Cascadia Wildlands that discovered under the Oregon State Endangered Species Act, no person may kill a state-listed species, and state law interprets that to mean no agency person even can kill state-listed species. The agency is considered a person, and the Ninth Circuit actually has affirmed that particular interpretation on a previous case. So we three filed a lawsuit to stop the killing, and it put an immediate halt because we got a court injunction that day. It was in October of 2011, and over the 2 years that it took to negotiate a settlement on that lawsuit, no wolves could be killed by the agency, and livestock protection measures had to be all non-lethal conflicts. I'll talk about this a little more tomorrow in my talk on the panel. And then in the 2 years following the settlement of the lawsuit, wolves were still in phase 1, the most protective part of the state plan. And so they really had high thresholds before they could go to kill wolves. So in that entire 4 years, from 2011 to 2015, the wolf population quadrupled and livestock conflicts went down because everybody was using non-lethal measures during that time. So that lawsuit was settled, and the way it was settled was we got very, very strict requirements on transparency and accountability and enforceability in phase 1 of the 3 phases of the wolf plan. Wolves are now out of phase 1 in the eastern half of the state. They're still in phase 1 in the western half of the state. So in phase eastern half, the wolf population is now large enough that they're actually in phase 3. So we're in the midst of negotiations on what the wolf plan update will be like. We don't want it to be as liberal as it currently is in terms of allowing killing of wolves. So we're trying to get some of the phase 1 settlement agreement terms put into the phase 2 and phase 3 of the wolf plan. So that's that lawsuit. The other lawsuit that we have filed, that we also filed with Oregon Wild and Cascadia Wildlands, was when the state prematurely delisted wolves in 2015. And so we filed a lawsuit not only over their premature delisting, but we also filed a lawsuit about the legislature's interference and taking over a duty that it really belongs to the judicial branch of the court. And they tried to, actually, as soon as we filed the lawsuit and then they passed that bill, they did try to get our case mooted, which is exactly what the intention of the bill had been. And the court threw it out, and we had to file a motion and say, wait, you haven't even heard arguments on this yet. And so we got the lawsuit reinstated, and the court agreed that we could go forward on both issues. So that case was orally argued last January. It takes a while for decisions to come out of the court, so we're still waiting for a decision on that. And that will be very interesting if the court rules in our favor that wolves have to be restored to state protections again. That's another question.
Okay, so as an activist, I just feel like we're putting up one Band-Aid after the other, year after year. And so besides political change and a complete reformation of our wildlife management and accountability in journalism, I was at an Arizona Game and Fish meeting recently, and I know they're about to launch a big campaign about the wonder of wildlife, which is code for hunt more. And I'm just wondering, does the center or any other organization have a plan to introduce compassion, ethics, and empathy into our educational system to make our children aware, because we're not going to get rid of these people. It's going to take forever to get rid of these people in power. It's going to be a war. It already is. And so if we don't bring up our next generation with a foundation of compassion and empathy, I don't think we're going to win. And so I'm just wondering, is there a plan that we can bring even hybrids into our schools, starting elementary, junior high, high school, and get people thinking about wildlife and what that means? And the golden rule, not based on humanity, but based on the biosphere.
So I think the answer to your question is more at the grassroots level, which is why we have the Call of the Wild campaign. And the reason I say it's more at the grassroots level is that I don't think there's a school across the country that's going to listen to us. But you live in that county, you live in that town, they're going to listen to you. You live in your county, you live in your town, they're going to listen to you. So part of what we're doing with the Call of the Wild campaign is to empower people to understand the system, to understand how you do a campaign for something that you really believe in. And you may have an overarching goal. You want compassion for wildlife to be built into our set of protective laws and how we function as a society interacting with the wild world. Okay, that's your overarching goal. From there, you develop a campaign strategy. And within that strategy, you develop different tactics of how you're going to achieve that. And for everybody, it's going to be different in your region, because what you're going to have to account for are what are your societal norms in your particular county or state or town. Who are the players that you are having to go up against? Whose minds you're going to have to change? Whose seats in the legislature or on your commissions do you need to fill? So all of those are tactics going to your strategies. You may have more than one strategy, and you may start one strategy and decide in the middle of it you're going to have to switch to a different strategy because that isn't working. But you have that overall goal. And so what I would say is our plan is to empower people at a local level to understand how to do this, because it's going to take more than just us. But what we can do is pass on our knowledge and pass on the support that we can provide. Say, for instance, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, but when we're asking people to go meet with their congressional representatives, how terrifying is that, right? So we're providing how-to guides. Here's how you call them. Here's how you say, no, I don't really want to do a phone conversation with you. I want to meet with you in person. Here's a fact sheet you can take in with them. So our contribution to that is to empower people with the tools they need to do it. Because I agree with you, it's essential. If we don't change that societal viewpoint, we're going to keep doing all these things that you're hearing us talking about now. I do think we can change it. I do think, look, as goes California, so goes the rest of the country. When you look at so many of the different impressive environmental protection laws we have passed in California, it starts a trend in other parts of the United States. So I believe we are on the cusp of doing this. It feels desperate at times. Don't ever let them make you think it's hopeless. Don't ever let them take away your hope. We still have hope, because when we fight, we win. What we can't do is not fight. How are we doing on time? That's okay. So you'll tell me when to switch into the next. Okay. Before I go into my next part.
The orchestra
Okay.
has not started playing
Okay.
yet.
Okay.
Anybody else have a question regarding the presentation so far from Amaroq?
More of a comment. Thank you very much for what you do, and thank you for giving us things that we can do on top of that. And to add on to what he just said, I'm from San Diego, and I'm a long distance away from any wolf in the wild. But what we do, we're an advocacy group that takes ambassadors to schools, and we just started a Boy Scout and Girl Scout program to where they can actually earn a patch. So we're trying to go after the young kids, and I agree that the next generation is really what's going to turn this around.
Thank you.
You keep you're answering a lot of my questions as you continue to talk, but with regard to us putting or attempting to get wolves back on the ballot in 2020 in Colorado, or putting them on the ballot, with everything we've learned, with everything we've gone through in Montana and what we're going through in Idaho and Montana and Wyoming, blah, 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 blah. How do you see that differing? Do you see it being different in Colorado? Do you think it's time? Do you think it's time to wait? Do you think the landscape of Colorado is now to put wolves back, or do you see us fighting the same exact fight we have in the other states? And how do we combat that?
So we have a Democratic House of Representatives right now. That is a huge thing for any of us that are fighting any wolf battles anywhere, because that means we're going to be able to stave off attempts in Congress to strip protections from wolves. We have the hope of a Democratic president this next election, so I would say everybody should be working their butts off to make sure that that happens, because that should, but will not always guarantee that we're going to have good environmental policies. The fact that we have Raul Grijalva as head of the House Democratic Natural Resources Committee is really imperative, who heads those. So Colorado specifically, the reason I mention these other things is when you talk about, is this the time? You have to look at the bigger picture of what are all the other tools in your arsenal. And knowing that we have Democrats in key congressional offices is also really, really important for even the state fights, because what happens is the states will then go to their congressional representatives and try to give them a thumbs down vote on protecting wolves, right? So because of those timing issues, I do think the timing is now, because this is now, I think, the 9th, 10th, 11th, maybe the 11th attempt by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to strip protections from wolves, either nationwide or piecemeal. That is going to keep happening. That is never going to change. They will keep doing that. So we have to keep hammering back. And what our response has to be is, no, we want more wolves in more places. And we are going to keep powering ahead. The American people want more wolves in more places. They want more wolves and less politics. I don't think that there's necessarily a better time in the future. I don't see a reason to wait in Colorado. I don't know, the interpersonal politics in Colorado, what's going on county by county, town by town. But I guess I would ask, why wait?
Well, we're not.
Okay, we're on the same page.
We're not. Yeah, my biggest thing was just, knowing the cognitive dissonance. We've got that issue on the Western Slope. We've got the ranchers. We're going to go through the same, the same scenarios that we have in Montana. And I speak of Montana because that's where, we fought.
Yep.
But I think going into Colorado, it is more of a progressive state. But we're going to have these same issues. And so trying to combat them, and you have an incredible helping, with that. I think that's where I'm concerned again, is knowing how to fight these fights differently than we have had to in the past. And
So we learn from what we've done in the past.
Yeah.
And as we learn, we keep adding to that list of what are our weapons of mass cognitive dissonance, destruction, countenance. What are we going to do to counter that? And so every time we learn, we add to that list, and all of those things are essential. I wouldn't say just any one of them is needed. You have to use as many of them as possible. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
I know there was some work with conservation groups meeting kind of in a roundtable situation in Oregon with policymakers to try and come up with these wolf plans, and then the conservation groups backed out. Is the reason that the conservation groups backed out because of the shenanigans that you kind of highlighted here, and do you think that that can work in other places? I guess why didn't it work in that situation, and how do we make that better, I guess, going forward?
We left the stakeholder process because of new shenanigans that occurred. So the wolf plan was supposed to be updated in 2015. It's supposed to be updated every 5 years, and instead the commission and the agency decided to spend the entire year of 2015 ramming state delisting through. So they didn't even get started on the process of updating the plan until January of 2016 when they held their first hearings. It took another year and 3 months before the agency came out with an initial draft of what they were proposing to update the wolf plan with. And that plan came out, that draft was April 2017. Nobody liked anything in it. The hunters didn't like it, the conservation groups didn't like it, the livestock industry didn't like it. We sent in massive comments, massive science papers, things that needed to be in there. They came out with a new draft in 2017, also in November. It was much better in terms of the science, but it still had awful provisions in it in terms of low thresholds for killing wolves. Nobody agreed with it. So they basically tabled it again. And we all urged them, and we especially put pressure on the governor's office, because this was supposed to be, her wolf plan, to get a facilitator to work with the agency, because the agency clearly wasn't listening to the public, to have a facilitator sit with the agency and the other stakeholders. And the agency is a stakeholder, by the way. They are a stakeholder, but to sit with the representatives from the livestock industry, the hunting, and the environmental groups. So they didn't start that stakeholder process until July of 2018. They hired a facilitator, and they wanted her to get it all done by September so that they could vote on it. And she's like, wait, why are you even having me here? So she told them it would take longer than that. We started having our first stakeholder meetings in September of 2018. So we had a meeting in September, I think in October, in November. We had one in December. We were supposed to still have one in January of this year. And what happened in those first couple meetings is the only groups that put forward actual proposals with 1 through 7, A through B, were the conservation groups. And we put together this whole proposal of what could be done that was very similar to phase 1, with requirements of transparency and accountability, and the livestock producers would get tons of help for non-lethal measures, not just financial assistance, but on the ground, on-site development of plans. And we were getting somewhere. And the groups, they were agreeing with that. Now, the hunters weren't interested in that at all. All they wanted to talk about was hunting wolves. But so we were getting somewhere in that. In the midst of that whole process, the agency stopped pretending that they were a stakeholder and started pretending that they were the facilitator. And then they started pretending that they were the decision maker. Well, they weren't pretending. They were actually doing all these things. They never really let the facilitator do her job. So when we put forward that proposal, they sent back a questionnaire to all of us of 20 different questions, trying to knock the legs out of every single piece of that. We can't do that, it's too expensive. We can't do that, it's gonna take too many staff. We can't do that, we can't do that, we can't do that. So they basically just rejected everything, even though we were coming to some agreement on that. Then we got to the point of talking about what should the threshold be before wolves are killed. How many predations and what level of non-lethal should be used. And the agreement under phase 1 was 4 predations in 6 months' time and a whole set of things that had to be done first. And I'll talk about that more tomorrow in the panel. And so we were trying, and the current level is only 2 predations in any amount of time. It could be 2 years, 2 predations, they can kill wolves. So we were trying to reach some place that was based on science that we could all agree on as well, whether or not it was based on science. We wanted the science. They wanted something they could live with. And we were kind of negotiating and getting someplace. And then the rancher said, well, we could live with 2 in 9 months. And the next thing we knew, the agency said, that's what we're going to propose to the commission. Before we had even had our final meeting, they basically pulled all the leverage away from us by just saying, well, that's what we're going to do. And so we said, what is the point of us coming to these meetings if they're going to knock down our fully fleshed out proposal piece by piece by piece, and they're just going to go with what the livestock industry wants without trying to find some kind of halfway point even. And so we realized that what we needed to do then was leave and point out to the media, the public, and the governor exactly what had happened. And so, we've taken some heat from it, from some people who think, oh, you abandoned wolves. No, we didn't abandon wolves. We weren't going to participate in a sham process that made it look like we agreed with what was going on, because we didn't. It wasn't, not only was it not best for wolves, it was not best for the stakeholders at the table. So we've had ongoing discussions with the governor's staff since that time. She has made a trip out to eastern Oregon to hear from some livestock producers who are much more accepting of wolves, people who are not the mouthpieces that are constantly quoted in the news stories. She's met with some people that have been working with Defenders of Wildlife on some livestock coexistence measures out there. So she got to hear something different this time from their community. And we're talking with her about other things, again, budget, what should that money go to when the state of Oregon does its budget. And so we're still hopeful that we can get some kind of a different process. But again, we're hearing that the commission is trying to ramp things up and maybe schedule a vote as early as May on a wolf plan revision that nobody agrees with. So we're still duking it out, but that's the story.